All right. So, welcome to today's session on writing for publication, and this is the lit review section. Um, we're going to call them webinars. We used to call them workshops when we would do things in person, but these are really kind of like more like webinar things. But the workshopy part can also be question and answer, and before sessions and after sessions, if you attend the Write to Publish sessions on Mondays, you can have that conversation. So today we're going to talk about the weekly assignment that relates to the literature review. We'll talk about some strategies for reading and tracking your literature, talk about some strategies for integrating your literature and common mistakes to avoid. All of this is within certain definitions of literature as well as different types of reviews. So we'll have different types of literature and different types of reviews that we'll talk about. I have included some PhD comics in this one just because I um, I love them. I heard Cham speak at Michigan State University when I was there in 2007. He was hilarious. And he has this kind of great insight and ability to kind of succinctly depict the issues that we face as researchers, and particularly as researchers, as graduate students and postdocs, that kind of early career phase, he's really good at. Um, so I love this, like, on how many references do I need to include? And it's like, well, and there's like too few and too many, and then there's just right, right? And so what's the optimal amount? And it's like a few. So between too few and too many, you've got a few. Um, but I love that people think you're making things up if you have too few, and people think you're unoriginal if you have too many. It also can vary from field to field, by the way. There are some fields where you don't actually include many references at all. And then there are some where you include all the references for anyone who's ever written about that topic, and it's not clear kind of what their positionality could be. There could be many different positionalities within those references. So it really varies from field to field. Just a reminder about the certificate and track for the next assignment for this week. It's on the literature review. It would be submitting a review plan. It's all on Canvas. If you don't yet have access, if you need access, just let me know. Happy to get you that. And that plan to craft a literature review. Again, you don't have to be working on a paper to do this, but it's really helpful for you to go through the process of at least knowing kind of for maybe a course project or thinking about a area that you want to study or review paper in general that you might want to be writing. So what type of literature review would you be interested in writing? What's for your paper if you're working on one? How long does it need to be? Are you talking about, like, is it pages? Is it just a section? Is it integrated? Is it spread out throughout the manuscript? There's any number of ways that it might work for your field. And so it's good for you to get a sense of like how long does that need to be? It also will give you some indication of if you know that you have 50, 60 sources and you're writing something that's going to condense down into a couple pages, what's that going to look like? How's that going to work? Um, how many sources do you need to include? How will you track those sources? Keep notes, make connections between the sources that you and the ideas, because I'll guarantee you're going to know that you read that article that one time that talked about that one topic, and then you're going to go searching for it, and you're like, wait, where is it? I cannot. And everything will become vague at some point in time, even if you've read it a couple times. So it's really helpful for you to start tracking the connections of that article specifically to different areas, different sections. Maybe it's only to the methods, maybe it's to the purpose or the significance. What is it that is important in that piece? And then how is it that you're going to keep track of it? And then list the tasks. This one's super helpful, even if you're imagining writing the literature review, the specific articles, kind of gathering them. What would a matrix look like? Can you put together a matrix? Could be a spreadsheet or a Word doc. We'll talk about that. What are your systems for taking notes, for tracking quotations, for drafting, revising? And then estimate the time and the schedule that you think it's going to take to complete this task. We'll talk a little bit about this within the context of Wendy Belcher's work and her recommendations. But these 6 questions, it looks like there's a lot there, but really you just have a sentence or so. It doesn't take much to answer these, just kind of like for you just to know Like, what is it going to take, and get you oriented to doing that literature review. As I mentioned, we're going to be referencing Wendy Belcher's writing your journal article in 12 weeks. We'll also talk a little bit, pull from becoming an academic writer. Some of you will have seen Patricia Goodson's matrix before. I've talked about this in other sessions, and if you've attended the standalone literature review workshop with CSU rates, I refer heavily to Patricia Goodson's techniques. And also know that that workshop is coming up. I think it's in a couple weeks, but it's coming up soon. So if you want to attend an additional workshop on the literature review where we go into these concepts more deeply for an extended period of time, just know that that's coming up. The two types of literature review that are most common. One, we often talk about it as just a review. It could be a standalone document, a survey of what's known about your topic, or a synthesis of current relevant literature and research that's informing your questions and topic and questions. And when we were talking earlier about scope and whether a document is in your scope or out, is it something that topically works with your topic and questions, or doesn't it? And I love that that kind of, well, I'm going to meet with my advisor and we're going to talk about kind of like what that is. And a lot of it may relate to the types of questions that you're interested in answering with your research and with your project. And that may determine where some of that scope is. That standalone document, if you're doing a standalone document as a review paper, oftentimes they're just talked about, again, as reviews. Those are not the same thing as peer review. And peer reviews are when you're solicited by because you're an expert in an area to read papers that have been submitted on a particular topic for a journal and to give feedback on those. And so we use review for in various ways, but different contexts. The literature review, and what we're mostly going to be talking about today, is a portion of a larger document. It's that section of a thesis, or it could be a dissertation, a research or scholarly article, right, that provides context and shape to the original research and the argument that's going to be put forth. It can also be part of a proposal, depending on the proposal. You will always give some sort of background and context, for example, for the work that you're doing that requires that you describe what the nature of the field is and other research that's been done. This portion of a larger document, though, can get us stuck a little bit if we have expectations on what we think that looks like. If we think, well, it has to be 3 paragraphs in this kind of way, or it has to be, whatever you're imagining that portion of a larger document to be, it's not set. I think what I'd like for you to take away from that notion of a portion, that it will be adjustable based on the type of manuscript you're writing, based on the journal that you're submitting to, based on your field and the expectations of your field. So, for example, in my field, in literary criticism, that portion of a larger document does not mean that it's housed and kind of truncated or put together in one section. We don't have something called literature review where we put all our kind of context for the background for our conversation and who we're in conversation with. It's integrated from the introduction all the way through and even into the conclusion. So we just pull it in as it's relevant to the topic and the point that we're making. So it's really free flow in my field. So that portion winds up being a braid. Some of you may be in fields like that, or you might be writing papers that would look something like that. Just know that then it doesn't have to be something that's chunked. I did get a paper reviewed back once from a journal where they said that they were confused on where my literature review was, and it's because I had weaved it in. And it was as simple as me taking out those sections that I had weaved through and just pulling it together in a single section and calling it, I literally titled it literature review, and then there was no problem after that. But in both of those, whether it be the standalone document or the kind of portion of a document, that literature is going to inform your research project. It provides space for conversation between what scholars before you have said and what you will say. And that is crucial. Note, however, that what the scholars before you have said, you are in charge of representing those voices. which is why it feels really heavy, I think, to put together literature reviews. That all of that weight of can I accurately represent? Can I wrangle in all of these different kind of ideas and voices? If you're in between disciplines or if you're working interdisciplinarily, can you bring in from all of these different disciplines the relevant conversations that are part of the topic that you're working on? And so it's a perhaps one of the areas where you're most responsible. You show the kind of most integrity and have the kind of heaviest weight of academic work weighing on you in the writing process, which is why it feels hard to do. We often kind of, if you put it off to the end, I highly recommend don't do that. But it's one of our impulses, I think. Well, I'm not ready to write it, or I'm not ready to do that. Just do it as you kind of move through the process and you're reading kind of gradually and make it a lot easier. And so you can then think about it as an iterative process, something that you are doing both as reading the literature about your topic and then writing a little bit about it, reading and writing, going back and forth, having conversations with your advisors, having conversations with colleagues, and that back and forth of writing doesn't mean that you're actually perhaps drafting out, but you're writing about those ideas. And then you're giving credit, you're making sure that you're always connecting back and kind of giving credit where credit is due and being able to track it. Wendy Belcher, she has a recommended schedule. So if you're thinking about that plan and what is it going to take, how long is it going to take for you to put together your literature review, this is what she recommends. And I find it fascinating, first of all. I think it works really well for some people. I would say, and you can kind of guess where I'm going just by how I set it up. I think it's a great place to start for trying to understand how long is this going to take me? I think for those of you who are at endpoints, I know we have some folks who have chapters that are fully drafted, people who are turning portions of dissertations right into articles. I think if that's where you're starting, this is probably a good schedule to pick up and say, okay, I'm going to prepare for an hour and kind of review what I've already got. That's what you're kind of reviewing your own context in the work, the purpose and the goals of the manuscript. Evaluate your current sources and citations. So you notice that there's already something there, spending an hour doing that. What I like about Belcher's recommended schedule here, that, kind of 1 and 2, is that you're getting reacquainted and grounded in the project that you already have going. If you have done research and you've done a poster presentation or a conference presentation or a presentation at colloquium in your department, whatever it is, you have something there to start with to be able to kind of pull from that existing literature probably. But if you're starting from scratch, I think this one's a little misleading. I will have to have conversation when we open it up later on about like an hour for review and context and purpose and goals. I suspect it would take significantly more than that. But I also like, however, that by the time you get to 3 and you look at the hours that are listed, 8 plus for identifying and reading your notes, that is a significant amount of time built in on this schedule. And it just, if you look at the percentage then, right? If we're looking at something like, what is that? The total hours here represented as something like 15 hours. Is that right? No, that's not right. So we have 5 plus 8. We've got about 13-ish hours, right? So of those 13 hours, a couple of them are spent for kind of getting an idea of what it is that you're looking for. And then after that, a good portion of it is really looking at what it is that you're reading and really digging through and into those sources. So that's an important measure for you to be reminded of, that writing and those writing tasks that you're doing, whenever your writing sessions are, it may be at some point that you spend more time reading in your writing sessions and taking notes than you spend writing. Right? Evaluating and clarifying the use of that related literature. She says it's about an hour. Sometimes that can be built into kind of your notes taking system, but like figuring out like how it fits within your own project might take some additional time. And then drafting it and revising and reviewing it, and kind of that's at least a couple hours. And again, she's talking about having something that is she's working largely with social science or an IMRAD structure with a literature review that's a standalone portion within, not a standalone review, but a portion within, and that's a section. And then how long would it take to draft and revise it? The key to remembering what you're doing with a literature review is that you're in conversation. think what can easily happen is that we turn into like these summary machines. And by the way, we could talk about AI as well if you're interested in how it is that it might give you some sort of like background or kind of base for talking about kind of a summary. But that summary, that kind of glossary view, is not then engaged or connected in conversation with your project, with your own readers. So there's a way that the literature review in bridging between past work that's been done, your current work as it is in the present, and then looking towards the future and future work, right? That conversation, you need to be able to identify where it's going to be read, right? Who you're in conversation with, and that's going to be the thing that makes it from being just a summary. Anybody can do kind of a summary of this is what I read, and that kind of comes across as a list. But to make it meaningful, connect to the purpose and the goals of your own research is really important as well. So my recommendation is to gather samples and models. If you've read literature reviews that you're like, oh yeah, this was really nicely done, then set that aside and it might be not actually within your own content area. It might not be something that you're interested in pursuing as your own research kind of area, but it might be something that is a document that demonstrates a really great literature review. Literature reviews, no, will be field specific. They're going to be oftentimes journal specific or to that article for sure. And they're going to have your own style. No matter what, it should be your style. And again, that's the challenge with some of the generative softwares, right? That it's not a style specific to you and to your project. Quick refresher on the types of scholarly literature out there, which will determine, again, thinking about towards the journal or what it is that you're going to be doing with the who wrote this first, or what are you working with and what you're putting together. Original literature includes primary sources, and depending on your field, that could be fiction, it could be artistic productions, historical documents, and so forth. Your primary sources, if you're in the sciences, are largely what it is that you're observing, and those are not exactly the literature, right? So it's primary is a little bit trickier if you're in the sciences, but if you're in social sciences, or you will have literature that's primary sources. It could be newspapers, by the way, if you're doing a study of newspapers. But newspapers could also be derivative or tertiary literature, meaning they're non-scholarly publications. They could be general reference. They set the context perhaps for you talking about some sort of phenomenon that happens within a certain time period or something along those lines. Most derivative or tertiary literature is not used in literature reviews at the scholarly level. You can use encyclopedias and textbooks, and I highly recommend those. And particularly if they're specialized encyclopedias within your field, to understand kind of who said what are the definitions in terms of conversation, but you wouldn't quote them. You wouldn't have those listed as sources in your literature review. The only way that they would be is if they're primary sources, and that would be because you would be writing, let's say, some sort of sociological study taking into account newspaper printing. There's contextual literature, and that's historical or may have to do with kind of the geographical or economic, demographic, kind of political context of your subject. Some of that may come from newspapers, again, if you're giving some context or layout for the politics of your field. But that contextual literature could also be .gov websites or data or other things like that. Methodological literature, that's literature that's related specifically to the methods of your topic. There are some journals where they have sections that are only about methods. And depends on your field, how it is that you might write those methods literatures. Theoretical literature, those are the conceptual approaches to your topic. They're entire articles, right, that are theoretical articles. And those are the ones that for me are just like, usually they're so dense, they're so complex that for me, that's slow reading, right, that you have to read through very slowly. Let me see. Got it. Thanks so much. And then related literature. So anything that is related to your topic, that's prior research on your exact topic. Mostly when we talk here in this context about the lit review, we're going to be talking about related literature mostly. But if you have questions about that, we can talk about it in the Q&A too. So some strategies for your reading. Um, I highly recommend using source management software if you're not already. At least having some sort of way of tracking hundreds of, you're going to wind up usually with hundreds of articles. So some way of tracking that and knowing what it is that you've got where. Um, Read those sources that will help, only those, by the way, it should be only those, right? That help you fill a gap in the field, make connections, fill your own arguments. After you identify those most relevant sources, read the most recent material first, because that also helps you backtrack into what it is that where you are, right? So are other people doing what you're doing? Or are other people kind of bypassing it? That gives you a great opportunity for to say, these are the new trends in the field. No one is really looking at this, and this is what we contribute. Or the new trends in the field are, this is a hot topic, and this is how they're talking about it and how they're covering it. Um, that my recommendation is to read more and take fewer notes if you can. When you're coming new to a topic, it can be everything looks great. You want to learn everything and know everything about it. And you probably you'll be taking a lot of notes just to be able to understand the topic within the context of the field and the specialty area that you're working in. But I still recommend take fewer notes if you can. You'll get bogged down in those notes if you don't. I highly recommend using something like a matrix. It could be, we call it a matrix because it helps you distill what it is that you see as being most valuable for that particular project and be able to kind of focus in on it. So that if you've got your notes, then you're kind of distilling those down into something like a matrix, and we'll look at some examples of that. But yeah, making sure you take fewer notes so that you can put those into the matrix, also helpful. And the strategies that I highly recommend for reading, it's a 3-step process. If you do this, just know that it takes a little bit longer to read initially, but it makes it a lot faster later on. It also can help if you're looking at how do you find your scope. How do you determine what you're going to be reading or not? So the first thing is skim. I think we're pretty good with top titles of articles. I think we're pretty good with abstracts. We generally kind of skim those pretty quickly to get a sense of whether we need to hang on to that article or let it go. Is it relevant? Is it topically connected to what we're working on or not? Is it the approach? Is that relevant or not? And so we can get that through a quick skim. Generally, if we've pulled it in, we know that it's relevant in some way. But then skim through the rest of the article. And the reason you do that is because it cues your mind to what the contents are, how detailed is it. Some articles, but based on the title, they sound like they're going to be amazing and these rich, full studies. And then once you start getting into them, you're like, well, this is pretty light. And there's only a couple points here that, would be relevant to me. So you get them on that first skim, and then you know a lot more on how much more time you need to be spending with that and if it's worth reading fully. And then go through and read it fully if you just determine after that skim that this is worth your time. And it's best if you can resist the urge to highlight as you read or kind of annotate as you read. If you could just wait and separate out the highlighting and the annotating and the note taking for the next step, that allows for you again to digest just a little bit more slowly or methodically, and for you to in separating out those tasks, then it's almost like you're not multitasking through this process. And then the last one is, and I don't know why it says 3-3, by the way, take notes and digest. And that literature review matrix can really help you then fully digest what it is that you're taking notes on. I think if you're adding things into your digest or a lit review matrix, that's at the point where you've decided that article contains enough or is viable enough for you to integrate and work with in your project. You can think about this strategy for reading as a way for you to build out your knowledge, right? For you to get a little bit more grounded in your field. But then you can also think of it as a way of being able to, I've talked about it as wielding your field, but basically what you want to do is you want to be able to, in conversation with your advisors, with your committee, and then in presentations later on when you're talking about the work that you've done, you want to be able to recall these studies. You want to be able to recall who has said what, why it's relevant, how it is that you've applied it, and who you're in connection with. So we'll take a look at what that matrix is and what it allows for you to do. And basically what it does is it consolidates your notes on your reading for easy access. It organizes your material in a searchable manner. I highly recommend using something like just a spreadsheet so that you can kind of cruise through it. But you could use something like Obsidian, a software program which allows for you to kind of map things out. You can use mind mapping software as well. It allows for you to capture your thoughts kind of, I'd say, as you read. It's really within that context of working through that one article. Again, I think if you just skim through and then read and then go through and then take your notes pretty quickly, that allows it, then you can put them in the matrix and allows for you to kind of recall them. Again, you can document it, and use it later. And it helps you identify, and this is something that's underrated, but it helps you identify different styles in academic work, ones that you might want to emulate, writing that's really well done. We often come to articles in a very consumerist approach. We gather broadly and widely. We look through them and we're searching through to find things that are relevant to our purposes. And then we kind of want to extract those. That kind of extractive approach sometimes means that we're missing all of the kind of the constructive approach, which is how these documents have been put together. And then when you sit down to write them, you're like, how did they do that? How do I do this? So it's really nice to have those models so that you can see, how it is that good research writing is put together. That transferring your notes to a matrix, this is what comes from Patricia Goodson's 50 exercises, right, for academic writers and becoming an academic writer. And I like it. I don't use it all the time. I do have my graduate students do it. And for our research projects, the graduate student is the one who kind of pulls this together and puts it into a matrix. What's lovely about that as well is then I can go to the matrix and I can see kind of what it is that has been identified. And then I can determine based on that and go back to articles. So even your faculty advisors could be working with this. But notice that it has kind of just your general information. A lot of this is pulled in, of course, if you're using Zotero or Mendeley. This is your citation management software program. So you might want to shorten this if you'd like. Patricia Goodson has kept these because they were useful for her at the time. I keep a slightly different one. We look at things like critical approach in my field. That's necessary. I have more quotations that are kind of more significant, I think, than what it is that Patricia Goodson was pulling in. She also keeps the document identifier separate from the citation, and I don't do that. I don't see it as necessary. So think about the matrix and what it is that you would find most helpful for tracking, and then just create one. It has to have some connection to the citation, some connection to the source, right? So that you know where it is, what it is that you want to learn and take from it. And then I do like the file located at. For me, that's because I work with a lot of interlibrary loaned materials. And so it's helpful for me to know, do I have a copy of this or do I not? And sometimes I do make like physical copies, photocopies of pages before I send a book back. And so I can make notes of that as well. So we know if they're photocopied pages, which sometimes happens in my field. But also note here, the last one that I keep is the author's network. And then I can connect with that person. And I'll show you, I think I have a sample here. Yep, included. This is for when I did Modern Language Association in 2017. This is a while ago. And I was working with Rita Felske's work on the limits of critique. It's not the first or last time that I've worked with that text. In fact, I'm working with a colleague on an edited collection where it's not entirely in response to, but it connects heavily to the limits of critique. So if you've used and put together a literature matrix for one project, you can put together a literature matrix for multiple projects. You might also not want to think about it in terms of project exclusive. Here we've set it up so that it would be something that would be related to your current article for publication or a chapter that you're working on, some sort of project, but you could keep a running lit review matrix. And I have that for me topically, for example, for teams or for mentoring. So we have these kind of running lists and doctoral writing. So there are certain topics that I just have a running kind of matrix. So it's not exclusive to only one project. It can be used on multiple projects. Then the challenge with that is a little bit with the quotations. If you're pulling quotations for a particular project, sometimes it's nice to have it just for that project, or you have to go back to your source. And thinking about that, going back to your source, the lit review is an iterative process. So you're going to find things that work. You're going to change and shift and adjust your project or your article a little bit, and then you're going to have to go back and find additional sources, perhaps. So that kind of iterative process will continue, even maybe after you've submitted, gotten a review, revise, resubmit, and then you may have to go back and gather additional sources, by the way. Reading and writing paired, right? Two of the sides of the same coin. But I'd like for you to think about like how Olivia Risland, she's at CU Anschutz as a molecular biologist. And she runs a lab, and this is in 2020, and I have not reached out. This is many years now. I need to reach out to her and just ask her if she's still reading a paper every single day and where she is in that process. But she says that dedicated time to reading papers is more important to her lab success than answering emails, rather than being a burden. Most of the time, it's a high point of her day. So in her field, and if you think about it, molecular biologist, and it's just easy enough for her to read an article a day, means also that she's not reading strategically only for one project. Slightly different approach, but you could also think about this as a model for even as you're reading for one project. Can you get through it one article a day and have it be a solid read, fully where you understand what it is that they're writing about, what it is they've done, what the value is for your field, and how you would talk about that paper. Depending on your field, like my art papers, they're 30 some pages and can be quite dense. That's a lot to ask, I think, for some folks. But if you are in a field where they are 7, 10, 15 pages, maybe not so much. Be all right. I think it's helpful for you to think about this as career-long strategies for reading. Get a lot of questions about how do we integrate reading into our writing practice. And again, same coin, two different sides. I would just think about it as how are you balancing in your writing sessions when you're showing up? Do you know when you need to be reading? Do you know when you need to be writing? That just thinking about that kind of pairing. It's the same with, are you generating new content? Are you editing content? Are you reading for the content, or are you writing about that content? And there's iterations, so it'll go back and forth. For you, it's about being clear at the session that you're writing in. And I just love this kind of evolution of academic freedom. Where does it we think that we are along this spectrum? But some helpful hints. Subscribe to those key journals. Many of you are already getting kind of key documents and things sent to you. But if you're not reading widely in your field, just start see what journals you can subscribe to, where it is that you can get the most recent findings information. I'm on the listserv for the National Academies in Sciences, and I find stuff all the time, chemistry that would be relevant to colleagues of mine in the chemistry department and all kinds of things. So read widely. Join a journal club where you're reading together and you have articles that are of interest that are the kind of top kind of end of the field right now, most cutting edge. And again, read an article or more if you can a day. And then integrating what others say into what you say. I love the piled higher and deeper. Don't forget credibility, right? That's our literature review creates that credibility. It absolutely depends on a thorough, literature review, research. If it's relevant, you have to cite it, even if you don't agree with the methodology or the same methodology. And I have to reference without deference. That's the preference. So again, depends on your field, but a lot of folks will just kind of cram into like and based on the field, right? And it's just if somebody's written about this topic, you're just giving credit saying they've written about that topic, but it may not actually be clear how it connects to your own perspective or research. Depends on your field. In my field, we always have to tell what it is that how we differ. Positionality is important in our field. All right, so they say templates. If you're thinking about like, how do I integrate? First of all, we'll have another workshop coming up for CSU rates, but these are in the Canvas course, and they're templates that give basic academic kind of integration sentence starters. So if you're looking for some sentences that help you introduce what they say, or introduce standard views, or something that you say, they also have, how do you contrast, or how do you align? There's all kinds of different phrases in the they say templates. So just take a look at those if it's something that would be helpful for you. And again, these are super basic and yet really helpful. If you're looking for kind of more and perhaps even more sophisticated ones, Manchester has an academic phrase bank, and you can just look it up. And they have different ways that you can look up language for classifying, listing, comparing, contrasting, giving examples, writing about the past. It's helpful to have some sentence starters. And I like it that it's structured really nicely on how you can get some information on integrating work. Let's take a look at a quick example. This comes from Ronald Kellogg and Alison Whiteford's piece on academic writing. It's about deliberate practice and the need for developing advanced skills in undergraduates. And they say that this is their abstract. I'm going to pull from the abstract, and then I'll pull just from a paragraph so you can see what they're doing. But notice that, and this is unusual, that they have citations within their abstract. That's not typical, by the way. It's pretty rare. But the development of advanced writing skills has been neglected in the schools of the United States, even with some college graduates lacking the level of ability required in the workplace. They cite this, the National Commission on Writing, and those years, in part to give the context that they're talking about something that's super, at the time, timely, and that it has to do with the workplace, and that they're not just making up that this has been neglected, right? That it's in the National Commission on Writing and 2 years of finding. And the core problem, we argue, again, thinking about abstract and going back to the last week's session on the abstract, the core problem, we argue, is an insufficient degree of appropriate task practice distributed throughout the secondary and higher education curriculum. We draw, so they have an argument and how it is that their methods and what it is that they're doing in this study. We draw on the power law of skill acquisition, the role of deliberate practice and expert performance, and the uniquely intensive demands that advanced writing composition place on working memory to make this case. And then a major impediment, ultimately in the end, we move towards their findings and towards their conclusions. Major impediment to assigning enough writing tasks is the time and effort involved in grading papers to provide feedback. We close by considering possible solutions to the grading problem. So they look at like, what's the problem with teaching writing? Why aren't students learning enough? We know how it is that they might be able to learn better, right? They need more feedback. How is it that we can get them better feedback ultimately? And so this is the kind of nature of their argument and conversation. That's a quick summary of their piece. And then just as a reminder that when you are telling the story of your own research, you are bringing together what it is that they have said about this topic before, who are they? And that's where you get your credibility. Again, you get credibility by demonstrating others have written about this or talked about this in particular ways. And so let's take a look at the Kellogg and Whiteford piece. And just this paragraph, portion of a paragraph right here. I love how, it good structure, effective writing skills are central in both higher education and the world of work that follows. One's ability to compose and extended text is the single best indicator or predictor, of success in coursework during the freshman year. Gains in informative and analytical writing ability are moreover taken as a good indicator of the value added by higher education. And finally, a large share of the value added by businesses in knowledge-based economy is codified in written documents, placing a premium on a highly literate workforce among college students. What I like about this model is that it moves smoothly from one idea to the next. And we're talking about effective writing skills. We're talking about how it is that those writing skills can predict success, and that the gains in information and ability are an indicator of the value added by higher education, and that the value by businesses in knowledge-based economy and written documents is necessary for us to understand. And they connect all of those, every point that they're making connects to a particular source, right? Geyser 2001, Benjamin 2003, Benjamin 2003, and Branch in 2005. I think the article is from 2005, 2007, somewhere around there. So these are current at the time. I like using this example because it's a well-written and it's topically, it's of interest to me. All right. So just some reminders on mistakes to avoid. I'm going to give you a list and then we'll wrap up and talk a little bit. But Belcher reminds us when we're writing our literature that there are certain things that we don't want to do. You don't want to cite one source too much. You want to make sure that you read widely and integrate appropriately. I know a lot of you are going to be having conversations with advisors or having, already worked with in conversation with your committees. But you might start with one source as a kind of inspiration, but then know that you need to spread out. You can also look to their bibliography. Who are they saying they're in conversation with? Always look to their bibliographies and go, oh, they're working with these ideas, and that can help you kind of fine tune as well. Citing irrelevant literature, something that's of interest but not relevant to your project. So make sure that you, in your literature review, include only what is relevant to your specific study. Lots of things may be of interest, lots of things may be tangentially connected, but only what's specific to your study. Make sure that you don't oversight definitions, right? So just clarify your terms, but don't, and you can use definitions and clarify based on citations and giving context of who's written about what. But definitions are kind of boring. Like nobody wants to read, well, according to Webster's dictionary, nobody wants to do that. Misattributions, really watch out for those. First of all, you cannot rely on AI. I just want to say you can't rely on other softwares to catch what would be a correct or incorrect attribution. That's something that only you can do. And you want to make sure that you don't attribute whole systems of thought to only one person. Make sure that you're giving credit where credit is due. If you're not, sometimes this is where people get charged with. It happened for a professor I knew at CU in Boulder, right, with misattribution. So you just want to make sure you're not charged with plagiarism. Be specific in your word choice and clear with who gets credit for what. And just a momentary pause here. So add more references to the manuscript. So I added more references, and great. And wow, did you really read all of these? Of course. And then he just looks, and well, define read. Maybe you need to reference the different dictionary, which is a little bit of a joke. But again, we've already talked about this process, and you need to read just enough, skim the rest, right? Citing citations and finding those, what you need to do is go and find the original sources. If you're citing something that's already cited, that just go and get the original and make sure that you're citing that one. Asides, where that's not really the main point, unless you're clarifying in your piece that you're connecting something. If it's just something that somebody has said as an aside, but it's not really the main point of that article, then it's not seen as highly valuable to be citing that paper. You need to get something that's clearly to the point of that article. Citing derivatives, those are the unscholarly materials, right, as research. We talked about that a little bit already, newspapers, magazines, blogs. If you're quoting too much, just make sure you can summarize, you can paraphrase, You can evaluate the related literature. If you're struggling with how to rephrase things, just step back for a bit, ask some friends to have a conversation with you, describe it to them in your own words, see if you can get back to it and not quote it. Omitting citations, this is another place where folks get stuck sometimes with if you just state it broadly and you don't fully cite it, and avoid those kind of vague references like what scholars argue or research shows. You want to make sure that you include who has said what to demonstrate the context of the field. Otherwise, again, you risk being charged with having kind of sloppy practices, research practices, but it could also come back and haunt you later on. And not to put too much stress on you, I think the literature review is one of the most stressful things that we write for our papers. But that kind of, I love this, how it's supposed to work and then how it usually works for writing is like, we think of it as this kind of like, yes, we have all of these processes that kind of naturally put us together and help us put together our articles. And then there's all these other functions that happen, which has to do with panic and fear and insecurity, confusion, no motivation, hesitation, that kind of get in the way, and notice where the typing is, where that happens. So if you start to stress, just take a breath, reach out. Happy to talk with you and have conversations about your literature review. So let's talk about literature reviews. If you're watching the recording, then just make sure, reach out if you have need. I look forward to seeing your submissions to Canvas, and you reach out at these addresses. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and stop the recording.